The morning sun cast long shadows across Riverside Avenue as Marcus, Chen walked his German shepherd, Duke, along their usual route. At 52, Marcus had learned to find peace in routine. The early morning walks, the quiet coffee afterward, the sound of Duke's tags jingling softly with each step. These simple things had become his anchor after his wife. Sarah passed 3 years ago, leaving him to raise their teenage daughter alone. Marcus wasn't the type of man who looked for trouble. He wore a gray jacket over a simple blue shirt, jeans worn soft from years of use, and boots that had seen him through countless construction sites. His face carried the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades working outdoors, with lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled at his daughter Emma's jokes. His dark hair, now threaded with silver, was usually a bit disheveled, especially on these morning walks when vanity seemed pointless. Duke trotted beside him, alert but relaxed. The dog had been Sarah's idea, bought as a puppy just months before she got sick. During those difficult final months, Duke had somehow understood, staying close to Sarah's bedside, resting his head on her lap when the pain got bad. Now the shepherd rarely left Marcus's side, as if the dog knew his human needed the companionship just as much. That Tuesday started like any other. Marcus had dropped Emma at school, listening to her chatter about the upcoming science fair. Her voice so much like her mother's, it sometimes made his heart ache. Then he'd headed downtown for the walk, the same path he took every morning before heading to the construction site. He was thinking about Emma's project, about whether he'd need to help her build the volcano display this weekend, when the sound of shouting cut through his thoughts. Down the street, near the bank on the corner, Marcus saw figures moving in a way that set off alarm bells in his mind. Armed men, 3 of them, backing out of the building. And there, in the middle of the street, a young police officer had taken position behind her patrol car, her weapon drawn but her stance uncertain. The officer couldn't have been more than 25. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and even from a distance, Marcus could see the fear in her eyes mixing with determination. She was calling into her radio, her voice carrying in the morning air requesting backup. But backup, Marcus knew from living in this neighborhood for 20 years, would take at least 5 minutes to arrive from the nearest precinct. 5 minutes was a lifetime. The robbers opened fire. The sound cracked through the air like thunder, and Marcus watched the young officer dive behind her vehicle, trying to make herself small. She returned fire, but her hands were shaking. One of the bullets struck near her, sending up a spray of concrete chips. She cried out, not in pain but in shock, her hand going to her face where the debris had cut her cheek. Marcus stood frozen for only a moment. In that heartbeat of time, he thought about Emma, about going home to his daughter, about the promise he'd made to Sarah to keep their family safe. But he also thought about another father, another family, waiting for this young woman to come home from her shift. His feet were moving before his mind caught up with the decision. "Marcus, no!" someone shouted from behind him. He didn't turn to see who. Duke barked once, sharp and urgent, and Marcus looked down at his faithful companion. "Stay," he commanded, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. But Duke had never been good at following that particular command, especially not when his human was in danger. The shepherd stayed at his heel as Marcus ran forward, toward the gunfire, toward the young officer who was now bleeding and alone. The world seemed to slow down as he crossed that distance. He could hear his own breathing loud in his ears, could feel each impact of his boots against the pavement. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he registered that this was insane, that he was a construction foreman with a daughter to raise, not a hero from some action movie. But he kept running. He reached the patrol car just as another volley of shots rang out. Marcus dove, sliding across the hood in a move that would leave bruises for weeks, and landed next to the officer. She stared at him with wide eyes, her hand still pressed against her bleeding cheek. "Sir, you need to get out of here!" Her voice shook, but underneath the fear was steel. Her name tag read Officer Rebecca Santos. "You need help," Marcus said simply. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw Emma in her face. Saw someone's daughter trying to do her job, trying to be brave. "I'm not leaving you here." Duke pressed against his leg, a solid, warm presence. The shepherd's eyes tracked the movement of the armed men, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Marcus assessed the situation with the same practical mindset he used when examining a construction site. The robbers were spreading out, trying to flank the patrol car. Officer Santos was injured, her hands still trembling as she tried to reload her weapon, and backup was still minutes away. "Can you cover me from the right?" he asked her, his voice calm, as if they were discussing the weather rather than a life-or-death situation. "I'm going to try to get to that position over there." He indicated a concrete barrier about 20 feet away. "It'll give us a better angle." Rebecca stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "You're not trained for this. You could get killed." Marcus smiled, a sad, gentle expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Officer, I've spent 30 years working construction in this city. I've walked steel beams 50 stories up. I've been in 3 building collapses, and I once had a crane cable snap 6 inches from my head. I'm not saying I'm bulletproof, but I'm saying I'm pretty hard to kill." He didn't mention that every single one of those close calls had terrified him, that he'd gone home and held Sarah tight after each one, grateful for another day. But fear and action weren't mutually exclusive. His father had taught him that years ago, when Marcus was just a boy learning to face down the neighborhood bullies. Before Rebecca could protest further, Marcus moved. He stayed low, using the patrol car as cover, Duke matching his movements with the precision of a trained partner. The shepherd seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. All playfulness gone, replaced by focused intensity. The robbers saw him moving and shifted their attention. Bullets sparked off the concrete near his head, but Marcus kept going, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. He reached the barrier and pressed his back against it, breathing hard. Duke settled beside him, panting but alert. From this angle, Marcus could see what Rebecca couldn't. A 4th man, trying to circle around behind her position. The man was young, maybe 19 or 20, with the jerky movements of someone high on adrenaline and probably something else. He was raising his weapon, aiming at the spot where Rebecca crouched behind her car. "Duke," Marcus said quietly. "Show me." It was a command Sarah had taught the dog during their evening training sessions in the backyard. Show me meant, alert me to the threat, make noise, draw attention. Duke barked, a deep, commanding sound that echoed off the buildings. The 4th gunman spun toward the noise, his weapon tracking away from Rebecca. In that instant, Rebecca saw him. She fired once, twice, and the man's weapon went flying from his hand. He stumbled backward, clutching his arm, and his partners realized they were now the ones being flanked. The situation shifted. What had been a straightforward robbery had become complicated. There was a civilian who wouldn't run, a dog who seemed to know exactly where every threat was, and a cop who'd found her nerve. The robbers exchanged glances, and Marcus saw the calculation in their eyes. This wasn't worth it anymore. They ran, just turned and bolted down the street, leaving their injured companion behind. In the distance, Marcus could hear sirens now, backup finally arriving. The whole encounter had lasted less than 3 minutes, though it felt like a lifetime. Marcus slumped against the barrier, his legs suddenly weak. Duke whined and pressed against him, the shepherd's warm body a comfort. Across the distance, Rebecca was standing now, her weapon still raised but her hands steadier. She was safe. The next few minutes passed in a blur. Police cars surrounded the area, officers securing the scene, paramedics checking Rebecca's injuries. Someone draped a blanket around Marcus's shoulders, though he didn't remember feeling cold. Duke stayed pressed against his leg, refusing to move even when an officer offered the dog water. Captain James Morrison, a tall black man, with gray at his temples and the bearing of someone who'd seen too much, approached Marcus as he sat on the back of an ambulance. The captain's expression was hard to read, somewhere between anger and admiration. "Mr. Chen," he said, his voice deep and measured. "That was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've seen in 30 years of police work. I haven't decided which." Marcus looked up at him, managing a weak smile. "Probably both, Captain." Morrison's expression softened just a fraction. "Officer Santos is going to be fine. Cuts and bruises, nothing serious. Thanks to you." He paused, studying Marcus. "What made you do it? Run toward gunfire instead of away from it like any sensible person would?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, his hand resting on Duke's head. The shepherd leaned into his touch, solid and real. "I have a daughter," he finally said. "She's 15, lost her mother 3 years ago to cancer." He looked up at the captain. "That officer down there, she's someone's daughter, too." I just couldn't walk away. Morrison nodded slowly. Your daughter know what you did today? God, I hope not. Marcus laughed, a sound edged with exhaustion. Emma would ground me for a month. The captain smiled at that, a real smile that transformed his stern face. Well, whether she knows or not, you saved one of my officers today. That matters. That matters more than you probably realize. Over the next few days, Marcus tried to go back to normal life. He went to work, he made Emma her lunches, he helped her practice her science fair presentation. But word had spread through the police department about what had happened, and Normal proved elusive. Officers started showing up at his construction sites just to shake his hand. Someone left a gift basket on his doorstep with a note that simply said, "Thank you, Officer Santos and family." The local news tried to interview him, but Marcus politely declined. He hadn't done it for recognition. He'd done it because it was right, because someone needed help, because that's what his Sarah would have expected of him. What surprised him most was the letter that arrived 2 weeks later, delivered by Captain Morrison himself. The captain stood on Marcus's doorstep one evening, still in uniform, holding a formal-looking envelope. "The department wanted to honor you properly," Morrison explained as Marcus invited him in. Emma was at a friend's house studying, so it was just the two men and Duke, who'd taken to following the captain, around with what Marcus could only describe as professional interest. Inside the envelope was a commendation, but also something else. An honorary membership to the department's K9 unit, extended to both Marcus and Duke. "We don't usually do this," Morrison said, settling into the worn armchair in Marcus's living room. "But Duke there showed the kind of instinct and bravery we look for in our police dogs. And you showed the kind of courage we look for in our officers." He paused, watching Duke nose at his hand for pets. "We'd like to invite you and Duke to train with our K9 unit. Nothing official, no obligation to serve, just teaching you both some skills. Maybe having you on standby for certain situations where we could use a civilian assist." Marcus stared at him. "Captain, I'm a construction foreman. I have a daughter to think about. I can't exactly make a habit of running into gunfire." "We're not asking you to," Morrison assured him. "But you have good instincts, and Duke is exceptional. There are plenty of situations where we need help that don't involve bullets. Search and rescue, community outreach, working with at-risk youth. The department could use someone like you, someone who understands what it means to serve without wearing a badge." Marcus thought about it. Thought about Sarah, who'd always believed in helping others. Thought about Emma, and the example he wanted to set for her. Thought about that morning when he'd run toward danger because someone needed help. "Can I think about it?" he asked. "Take all the time you need," Morrison said, standing. He pulled out a card and set it on the coffee table. "My direct number. Call me when you decide." That evening, when Emma came home, Marcus sat her down and told her everything. He'd kept the details vague until now, just saying he'd helped a police officer, but she deserved the full truth. She listened in silence, her eyes growing wider with each detail. When he finished, Emma was quiet for a long moment. Then she got up, walked over to where he sat, and wrapped her arms around him in a fierce hug. "Dad," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder, "you're an idiot." Marcus laughed, the sound surprised out of him. "Yeah, I know, but you're a brave idiot." She pulled back to look at him, and he saw Sarah in her eyes, in the set of her jaw. Mom would have been proud, scared out of her mind, but proud. "What about you?" he asked softly. Emma smiled, reaching down to scratch Duke behind the ears. "I'm proud too, and I think you should do it. The training thing with the police. You and Duke, you're good together. You help people." She paused, her expression turning serious. "Just maybe try to avoid the actual gunfire part from now on?" "Deal," Marcus agreed, pulling her into another hug. 3 months later, Marcus and Duke completed their training with the K9 unit. It wasn't official police work, but it was something meaningful. They helped with search and rescue training, worked with the community outreach program, and once, memorably, Duke helped locate a missing child who'd wandered off during a street fair. Officer Rebecca Santos became a regular visitor to their home. She'd recovered fully from her injuries and had been promoted to detective. She and Emma bonded over their shared experience of having Marcus in their lives. "He's stubborn," Rebecca told Emma one evening. "Won't listen to common sense to save his life." "Tell me about it," Emma laughed. But it was the change in Marcus himself that meant the most. For 3 years after Sarah's death, he'd been going through the motions of living, doing what needed to be done but feeling distant from it all. Now he felt connected again, to his community, to a purpose beyond just getting through each day. Captain Morrison noticed it during one of their training sessions. "You seem different," he observed, watching Marcus work with Duke on a tracking exercise. Lighter somehow. Marcus considered that, watching Duke circle back to check on him before returning to the scent trail. "I think I forgot for a while that I could still make a difference. That my life could matter beyond just taking care of Emma." He smiled. A real smile. "Don't get me wrong, Emma's my world. But Sarah always said we're meant to reach beyond our own little circles, help where we can. I lost sight of that for a bit. And now?" Morrison asked. "Now I remember." Marcus called Duke back, the shepherd returning to his side immediately. "We both do." The story could have ended there, a neat resolution to an unusual chapter in Marcus Chen's life. But life rarely works in neat chapters. 6 months after his commendation, Marcus and Duke were called on again. An elderly woman with dementia had wandered away from her care facility during a storm. The official search and rescue teams were stretched, thin with multiple emergencies, across the city. Captain Morrison called Marcus at 11 at night, his voice tight with urgency. "I know it's late, and I know it's asking a lot," Morrison said. "But we need Duke's nose, and we need someone who won't give up. This woman's been missing for 6 hours in the cold rain." Marcus didn't hesitate. "Text me the address. We'll be there in 20 minutes. He left Emma with their neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, an older Korean woman who'd become like a grandmother to her. Emma hugged him tight before he left. "Be careful, Dad, and find her." "We will," he promised. The search lasted through the night. Marcus and Duke worked alongside the official K-9 units, covering sector after sector of the wooded area near the care facility. The rain had washed away most scent trails, making the work nearly impossible. Marcus's clothes were soaked through, his body aching from hours of trudging through mud and underbrush. But he kept going, because somewhere out there was someone's mother, someone's grandmother, frightened and alone in the dark. It was Duke who found her just after dawn. The shepherd's bark changed pitch, becoming urgent and excited. Marcus followed the sound to a small drainage culvert where the woman had taken shelter. She was hypothermic, barely conscious but alive. Marcus carefully lifted her, wrapping her in the emergency blanket from his pack. She was so small, so fragile in his arms. She mumbled something in Spanish, words he didn't understand but whose meaning was clear. Gratitude, relief, fear fading, into safety. "I've got you," he told her gently, starting the trek back to where the paramedics waited. "You're safe now. We're going to get you home." Duke walked beside them, occasionally glancing up at Marcus as if to make sure he was okay with the extra weight. Always watching, always protective. The woman's family met them at the ambulance. Her daughter, a woman about Marcus's age, collapsed in tears of relief when she saw her mother alive. She turned to Marcus, trying to form words, but her voice kept breaking. Marcus just nodded, understanding. "I'm glad we found her," he said simply. "I'm glad she's okay." Later, as the sun fully rose and Marcus finally headed home, Captain Morrison walked with him to his truck. Duke was already asleep in the passenger seat, exhausted but content. "You know," Morrison said thoughtfully, "when I first met you, I thought you were just a guy who got lucky. Right place, right time, made the right choice in the moment." He paused, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. "But I was wrong. This is who you are, someone who shows up, someone who doesn't quit." Marcus leaned against his truck, feeling the weight of the long night in every muscle. "I'm just doing what I can, Captain. That's all any of us can do." "Maybe," Morrison agreed. "But most people don't. Most people have good intentions. But when it comes down to it, they find reasons to look away, to let someone else handle it." He smiled, extending his hand. "I'm grateful the city has people like you in it." They shook hands, the grip firm and warm. Then Marcus climbed into his truck, Duke stirring just enough to rest his head on Marcus's leg, and drove home through the quiet morning streets. Emma was waiting when he got home despite the early hour. She'd made coffee and toast, simple and perfect. They sat together at the kitchen table. Duke stretched out at their feet, and Marcus told her about the search, about finding the lost woman, about the cold and rain and the moment when Dee